Good morning. It is a great joy and honor for me to be here and to be in the presence of the great Dr. Felker Jones and to be back at Wheaton for this wonderful theology conference. I want to thank Dr. Baumgartner for that absolutely wonderful poem. I love your work, and to hear you is such a great joy. I also want to acknowledge the presence of one of my wonderful colleagues from Duke, Dr. Meredith Riedel, who is here, the brilliant Dr. Riedel, and I'm thankful for her. Yeah, you may applaud. She was once here. And there are many other friends and colleagues who are present. I won't start calling names, but I'll just wave at you so that you know that I see you, and I'm glad to be in your presence and look forward to our time together. I am blessed to be the father of two wonderful daughters. Their lives precious to me, and their well-being of the highest importance. I'm also the youngest brother of several sisters who each took a hand in raising me and who allowed me to see the harrowing journey of women of color in America. Is there an echo to my voice? Can you turn that down just a little? Thank you, buddy. I wanted to spare my daughters a crucial aspect of that harrowing journey, namely, having to face the aesthetic regime of whiteness. But I knew that the minute they began to see the world and see the world looking at them and see themselves through that world looking at them, that they would share with my sisters, my mother, my father, and with me, an intimate agony. That agony was forced on all the people of color that formed my family and community through an education in the racial aesthetic, the power of which and the reach of which has been breathtaking from its emergence on the modern colonial stage to our current moment. We are all the inheritors, or should I say more precisely, the cursed children of a way of viewing the world and our bodies immersed in the optics of whiteness. We live in what I call Caucasia's capital. Capital in this context is both spatial, productive of centralized body and place, and fiduciary, productive of trust and economic facilitation. Whiteness in this regard is a founding form of modern capital. In fact, the modern body, our bodies, would be impossible to understand without the ordinary presence of whiteness. In order to understand this ordinary presence, we must think of whiteness not only as a way of being seen, but also as a way of seeing, not only as an anthropological object, but also as the progenitor of modern racial anthropology and modern racial subjectivity. It is this dual reality of whiteness that has made it so difficult for us to grasp its power. We live in the midst of a white aesthetic regime born of Christianity that deeply disrupts our understanding of ourselves as creatures created in the image of God. Christian theological anthropology and current theological reflection on aesthetics have yet to take seriously the depth of our entanglement with this racial optic. My presentation reflects on the continuing power of that regime in hopes of helping Christians more clearly and more faithfully engage the aesthetic struggle against it and to begin to imagine an aesthetic practice that gestures the redemption of our sight. For our sight needs redemption. And with our sight, our desire, and our body. So in what follows, I dream aloud the possibility of overcoming the white aesthetic regime by first considering briefly its origins, its current realities, and then drawing a little bit on the thought of John of Damascus, a possible way forward. So first, our education in racial aesthetics. The birth of the white aesthetic regime is not a new story, yet it remains an amazing one. It emerged where early European visions of the true, the good, and the beautiful merged with their sense of absolute power over the spaces and bodies of indigenous peoples. At that intersection, fantasy joined the desire for order, rightly ordered spaces, rightly ordered bodies, and rightly ordered relations. Two different but deeply related perceptual logics of order flowed out of their fantasies: the salvific and the pastoralist. The salvific and the pastoralist in this regard have primarily to do with correctly ordered spaces coordinated with correctly ordered bodies. Missionaries and others imagine built environments that join cultivated lands to beautiful churches and to docile and submissive, saved slaves and indigenes. Early European Christians, as they emerged as central New World powers, drew on a scriptural imagination in which they saw themselves as the people of God, having supplanted Israel, as the authentic people of God. They saw themselves as the embodied will of God for the worlds. They were those who could discern the difference between the demonic and the holy, and who therefore could refashion the bodies and behaviors of New World's peoples toward the path of salvation. They also saw themselves as people who were ordained to set places aright, set places on a path toward order. The New Worlds were, in the minds of the colonialists, places of chaos that called for order. So the pastoral care of bodies would merge with the pastoralist control of space for the ordering of plants, animals, places, and landscape as befitting an orderly, that is, redeemed environment. On such ground of body and space, the true, the good, and the beautiful were constituted. Those who now constituted that ground were also the ground on which aesthetic discernment would grow. Early Europeans became the merchants of the universal. They trafficked in both its creation and its presentation. Here we must hold together the conceptual and the commercial, recognizing the ways in which early Europeans set in place an economic cosmopolitan sensibility that flowed around their bodies. Not only did they invite the people of colony and metropole to discern the transcendent along Europe's tutoring lines, but they also gave material direction to that discernment. Riding high on the collaborative work of the merchant and the missionary, Europeans would establish orthodoxy of thought and orthodoxy of consumptive taste. Hence, not only was the Bible translated into many tongues and places, along with Orthodox Christian thought and its foundational ancient antecedents like Hellenistic philosophy, but also also into the value of, say, for example, a high-quality cigar, a beautiful dress, wonderful music, fine rum, fine port, fine wine, excellent literature, proper shoes, exquisite architecture, a classic man or woman's attire, and so forth. Across the far reaches of these colonial operations, worlds of peoples were invited and often forced to discern the true, the good, and the beautiful wrapped around white bodies. This effect has been far more significant than merely being examples of benign or malignant forms of enculturation. Orthodox thought was joined to orthodox objects. More precisely, joined to objects that help to make one materially orthodox, rightly ordered. The point, however, is not the orthodoxy of the objects, my friends, but the orthodoxy of the desire for those objects. A new way of imagining life rode in on the ships coming from the old world to the new worlds, a way of life that presented new paths of growth, maturity, and of becoming. Becoming what? The precise nature of what one became was not the point. The point was the orthodoxy of desire, the desire to become. Indigenous peoples living under the influence of settler cultures experienced orthodoxy not only in being pressed to adhere to Orthodox Christian beliefs, but more decisively through the comprehensive disciplining work that orthodoxy had on aesthetic frames of reference. Orthodox thought seeped into objects of consumption. The objects of the Euro merchant did not necessarily present one particular way of life. Rather, they presented new, more acceptable directions for fantasy that would bind peoples to disciplines of education, behavior, mood, and manner commensurate with civilizing impulses. The historical trajectory of this operation is yet to lose its aesthetic pull. The Western world, our world, functions inside a racial imagination that endlessly creates and coordinates images that hold up white bodies as the tutors of desire, guides for fantasy production, and the sites on which the world is invited to imagine its humanity, especially its nobility. One of the central strategies peoples have used to combat this visual order of things has been to seek an image exchange, drawing on cultural and racial alternative portfolios. This is an honorable, yet short-sighted tactic. What we need, what we have always needed, is the longer view of what is now in place. What is now in place? A tacit global agreement regarding the vicarious reality of white bodies to signify humanity for us, to be the ground on which we all fantasize. We have yielded our collective imaginations to white aesthetic supremacy, signaling with every turn of media currents is right of way. Now, I am not saying that white bodies are the only bodies functioning vicariously, nor am I denying the presence of the visual multicultural, nor am I blind to the presence in some parts of the world of episodic and predominantly ethnic representations in advertisements, movies, and so forth. These visual effects, however, are primarily contrapunctual rather than counter-hegemonic. They draw on narrative frames that are improvisationally limited and reaffirm the pedagogical position of white bodies as as archetypes. We are all children who have been schooled in a racializing pedagogy that disciplines our collective fantasies. This pedagogy has always offered a powerful invitation to us to see the world through eyes hostile to our bodies and immersed in a racially charged and unrelentingly evaluative gaze. I am also not disregarding the important counter voices that have always pressed against this order of thing through alternative arts, critiques, and or creation of aesthetic spaces that speak of a different way of discerning the good, the true, the beautiful, the intelligent, and the noble. These alternatives have always and will always continue to offer hope. More importantly, these alternatives show us that we are indeed always in need of images, always in need of images, and that image making is fundamental to human existence. The great need for images, or more generally, the artistic, shall I say, coupled with the urgent need to overturn the racial aesthetic, for me, constitutes a set of conditions reminiscent of the epic iconoclastic, not enough coffee, iconoclastic crisis of the Eastern churches in the 7th and 8th centuries. The struggle over icons, over images between governmental and ecclesial officials who wanted them banned, and those ecclesial officials and lay people who understood icons to be an integral and necessary part of Christian devotion and identity, created what has been known as the iconoclastic crisis. It was a crisis that centered on the control over the devotional life of the Christian populace by seeking to establish the proper lines of fantasy production away from alleged idolatry and toward orthodoxy. The iconoclasts seemingly had the stronger argument against icons as they equated icon creation with idol production and icon veneration with idol worship. The iconoclasts interpreted artistic objects through a hermeneutic of idolatry. That is, as objects of veneration placed between God and humanity. That was fundamentally an obstruction that drew attention away from the divine and toward the creature through creaturely elements. John of Damascus understood that idolatry was not inherent to the creation and use of images. 645 to 749, he lived under the shadow of Islamic rule. The real issue, as he saw it, was the nature of veneration. For John of Damascus, because God had become incarnate, become flesh, the body and the material realities of the world mattered in a new way. The material realities of the world took on new signifying capacities for the life of faith. So Damascus suggested that we need to understand the precise nature of veneration, how it may lead to idolatry, and how it does lead to imitation, or using more contemporary language, how it leads to mimicry. Damascus recognized that there were artistic currents all around us. And the only real question was concerning their redirection. Because God had become flesh, God could be imaged through the body of the Son. God could be drawn and painted. And equally important, those women and men who were with God, who knew God, who loved and served God, they could be imaged as well. They could be drawn, pictured, painted, and offered up to the faithful as images to guide their prayers, their hopes, their dreams, their longings, and their concerns. In short, bodies offered up in artistic display, in impressive exercise of spiritual power, or in commanding control of their souls, especially in times of great temptation and suffering, were poised not only were poised to guide not only our imaginations, but our fantasies and our lives as well. Veneration, however, he understood, was delicate, complex, and dangerous word. Delicate, complex, and dangerous work because it involved educating all the senses in a particular direction that was nothing short of establishing the foundations of lifelong devotion. Foundations of lifelong devotion. The ever-present reality of artistic currents and our need for images is precisely why, my friends, the rise of the racial aesthetic has fundamentally emerged as a secular process of veneration in the West, one that churches have wholly received into themselves. A secular process of veneration. This process of veneration has woven itself deeply into our political, social, and ecclesial unconscious. This path of racial veneration is where particular bodies become the sites for imagining the universal, and where only particular bodies expose the maturity to dance in the universal. I suggest we think of this process of veneration in three gestures that constitute the white aesthetic regime. These gestures are imitation, reflection, and evaluation. Imitation, reflection, and evaluation. In the time I have left, I will only consider briefly the first gesture, imitation, which is the basis of the other two. The path of veneration opens inevitably toward imitation. If, in fact, the early colonial European had seen God, as he suggested when he came to the New Worlds, then those who wished to see God must look to him, look at him. Imitation begins fundamentally as a process of looking. The work of racial mimicry that emerges out of this new reality of veneration is not simply a matter of copying something or someone. The process of racial imitation or mimicry enfolds peoples in unrelenting patterns of comparison bound to visions of originals and copies. Imitation in this regard is not simply a power that continuously generates white body exemplars of beauty, goodness, and truth, but also carries forward housing capacities, patterns of thinking and ways of being within which peoples may judge their own bodies, their own manners and moods. These housing capacities means that many peoples have been and continue to be invited to imagine their worlds through white bodies, often bound to Western, Euro-Anglo processes of canonization. Now, whether something should or should not be canonized is really irrelevant to this analysis, though we can talk about that over coffee later on. What is crucial here is the way these canonization processes operate within and between the arts and forms of commerce. Imitation means people the world over have entered into a powerful accomplishment. They have yielded to the constant work. They have yielded to the constant work of approximation. The joining of worlds, the native particular to the white universal, did not mean the loss of indigenous agency or the denial of people's abilities to determine their lives, express themselves, and make choices. It did mean that all peoples influenced by colonialist legacies were bequeathed with the struggle with and against white approximation. Even as native peoples mixed and matched early European cultural realities with their own, creating the cultural motizo. And even as settler cultures changed through encounters with indigenes, The arc of the universal bent toward whiteness, as creative powers were by choice and force marshaled toward the flourishing and supremacy of white bodies. The inertia of that force created imagistic echoes of what a flourishing life looks like. What does a flourishing life look like? Don't tell me with your words. Tell me by what you look at. The accomplishment is the iconic position that has been established around white bodies that allow them generative centrality. Generative centrality. Imagine a crowded bus in a major city. Mexico City, Accra, Ghana, Los Angeles, Mumbai, New York, Chicago, LA. A bus filled with a wide variety of people. And there, hovering above every head, is a Tommy Hilfiger advertisement with several models dressed in the company's latest creations. At the heart of that picture are white bodies, a white man or a woman, easily identified as of European descent. And around them are others, appropriate to different cultural contexts. Although these others are not white, they look like the white-centered subject. Same facial features, same body shapes, similar poses and postures toward the world. Some have shade of skin very close to the models at the center of the image. Now, my concern in this instance is not the justice of the advertisement or the power of the company, but the currency of approximation that flows through the image. The point of imitation here is not that everyone looking at the advertisement wants to become the model. The point that flows from the center of the advertisement out to us is surrender. Surrender. We are invited to read the image like Scripture, like a secular lectio divina, through which we meditate without giving thought to it, without seeking to understand it, but to allow it to bring its multiple meanings to us. Those meanings flow around the objects of consumption. Sorry. Beth, I think I need your help. I lost my thing here.
I can't guarantee I'll be helpful.
There we go. Thank you.
Is that where you want to
That's what I mean. Thank you. Those meanings flow. Oh, yeah. All right, there we go. Those meanings flow around the objects of consumption suggested by the advertisement. Yet, as is generally understood, these images are more so suggesting, fantasizing ways of life than they are offering commodities. The expectation is that we surrender our fantasy work to the image. The surrender is not complete, but a surrender that launches and directs fantasy, building from the beginning of the image. We can imagine ourselves wearing some or all of their clothing or making up and looking good to ourselves and to others. Our fantasies can ride on the bodies of these models. The models, however, are not simply glorified clothes hangers. They become the bearers of possibility for us, of change, of improvement, of uplift, of development, of sheer newness in our looking and our gazing. They become postures with salvific aim. The first gesture of veneration is therefore not a simple act of copying. No. Mimicry opens up agency and a sense of self constituted in the work of approximation. We are invited to imagine our own possibilities flourishing through gazing at white bodies. It is our self-fulfillment. Model here refers to far more than the living mannequins of magazines, but to an entire universe of archetypes that populate stage, screen, video game, and internet, and who echo back to the artistic white supremacy of the past. The past speaks to the present and guides the future, so that yearly we are presented with the spectacles of aesthetic validation that reward the best performances, which unrelentingly mirror back to us the white universal. These racial images in media help us find ourselves. But who exactly are we who are in the work of being found, who are being captured in the diligent work of approximation through what we consume? We are people in search of ourselves. We are caught in an abiding indeterminacy, For so many people of color, a cultural and racial indeterminacy emerged with the visibility of the white image presented for approximation. That visibility has bequeathed to untold generations of people two horrific problems. First, it gave us the curse of authenticity. It is only with the rise of whiteness that people the world over were forced to entertain a horrible question. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to look culturally and racially authentic? What a horrible question. This is a question that one can only make sense against the backdrop of white veneration, and it can never, ever be answered. The second horrible problem was and is the stubborn habit of visual life in the West that drives us to constantly want to clarify the racial status of one another. We learn to determine as quickly as possible the status of those we encounter. Are they black? Are they white? Are they Hispanic, Latina, Latino, Native American, biracial, Asian, mixed, mutt? What are they? And what is the status of their racial, cultural self-knowledge? Do they carry their racial being strongly, softly, clearly, or in a confused manner? Now, shaming the desire for definition is not the point. Rather, it is grasping how it is vivified by the iconic energy of white visibility. Racial reading of bodies has always had deep political, social, and economic consequences. It has always been deadly serious work and fundamental to the policing operations of America, as we know, externally and internally. Racial reading is deadly work. The task we face is to imagine a way of seeing that enables new ways of seeing, new signifying capacities for the life of faith. So I return finally to John of Damascus. Damascus argued that the incarnation, in which the Son of God fully assumed material form, established for us a powerful new vision of the world. Following the logic of the Cappadocians and Irenaeus before them, Damascus understood that the divine embrace of creaturely existence witnessed in the incarnation magnified the sheer goodness of creation. The world is suitable for divine presence, and moreover, the site for eternal communion with the triune God. This affirmation challenges the tragic religious habit of separating life between the worship of God and the artistic currents of creation. The prohibition against idolatry is not aimed at creation's artistic currents, but their misdirection away from God and toward the creature. As Damascus famously stated, I do not venerate the creation instead of the Creator, but I venerate the Creator, created for my sake, who came down to his creation without being lowered or weakened, that he might glorify my nature and bring about communion with the divine nature. End of quote. This statement reflects the fundamental theological justification for icons, for images that may be brought into the inner life of faith. This also shows us that what it means to understand the creation as iconic. The creation is meant for communion with God. God wills to reach out to us, embrace us in unrelenting love and care in and through the material. The key here is the direction of movement. God is reaching out to us, looking, as it were, at us in desire of us and for us through the icon. This is the redirecting of the currents of the artistic. Again, I quote Damascus. I do not venerate matter. I venerate the fashioner of matter, who became matter for my sake and accepted to dwell in matter, and through matter worked my salvation. And I will not cease from reverencing matter, through which my salvation was worked. I do not reverence it as God. I reverence the rest of matter and hold in respect that through which my salvation came, because it is filled with divine energy and grace. End of quote. I take from Damascus's important insight our need for the artistic. We need the artistic to draw us toward life and away from death, and to nurture our souls through communion with God. Damascus sees the artistic as participatorily redemptive. One more quote, and then I'll stop quoting Damascus. I come into the common surgery of the soul, the church. The luster of the paintings draw me to vision and delights my sight like a meadow, and imperceptibly introduces my soul to the glory of God. I have seen the perseverance of the martyr, and as if by fire I am eagerly kindled with zeal, and falling down I venerate my God through the martyr, and I receive salvation. End of quote. So there is an abiding connection between artistic renderings and the movement of God incarnate toward us in the Holy Spirit. To take an iconoclastic position against the artistic denies this salvific movement. So the crucial matter that emerges in Damascus's anti-iconoclasm is how might gestures of veneration be turned toward life? That's the question I ask as I look at images like the one behind me, as I watch my daughters looking. How might gestures of veneration be turned toward life? Here, drawing from his meditation, we could suggest 3 points of theological intervention into our current situation. First, churches need to develop an artistic ecclesiology. We must deepen our sense of common church life as not simply containing artistic expression, but church life constituted as artistic expression. The church is the place of artists. Let the artist rise. Let the artist rise among us. Let the artist rise in us. We together are called to help people grasp their embeddedness in both the artistic currents of creaturely existence and also through the Holy Spirit in the expressive impulse of God. This means that creativity is our deepest life calling, our true vocation. Rather than killing or seeking to domesticate the artistic currents in us, churches should enter into the revolutionary power of creativity as its birthright. This is not an exclusive birthright, but the inheritance of leading the creation in the praise of God through the material realities of existence. Creativity in this regard is a much wider reality than a capacity deployed in artistic expression, but rather a fundamental way of life that is open to the expressive impulse of the Spirit of God. Here, agency is exposed exactly in the places where artistic currents are being turned toward death through the racial aesthetic. Here we may take hold of what James Scott designates as one of the arts of resistance, used by subjugated peoples to take the given objects of desire and processes of control, and turn their trajectories against them. Genuine new possibilities demand a space where beauty may be collapsed into the opposite, that which is ugly. In such spaces where beauty and ugly collapse onto each other, they are both broken open by a life that challenges the power to define beauty or ugliness, goodness or evil, truth or the lie, wisdom or foolishness. Jesus draws us into his life, in which we no longer know him according to human standards, but are now caught up in the redemptive dynamic of life, where worldly optics are overcome. A second point of intervention would be cultivating creative critique of the prevailing racial aesthetic. This would be part of the development of an artistic ecclesiology that recognizes the importances of image and fantasy. We cannot, nor should we seek to stop the flow. The question is, how do we move in these currents? How do we redirect the flows, the artistic flows, toward life and away from death? The third point of intervention is this: image and fantasy must be considered in community. Fantasy is connected to faith. Fantasy is also bound up inside of hope. Yet the question that must be answered in community is, how might fantasy work by love? Here we are at the threshold of lifelong struggle. The struggle is to move fantasy from being directed to chaos and nothingness and the objectification of one another within economies of exploitation to fantasy, toward fantasy that grows out of direct encounter, reciprocity, and the realities of one flesh in Christ. Where do fantasies get in the way of relationship? And where do they open up deeper depths of relationship? This is the question that we must answer. Of course, many churches are not yet ready to live in the real intimacy of human life constituted by the body of Jesus, just as many churches are not yet ready to face the tragic fantasy that shapes them inside the white aesthetic regime. Thank you very much.